The broadcast began not with silence but with laughter, a cruel synthetic laugh piped through every screen across the galaxy. It echoed in homes, on street corners, in crowded work bays where miners wiped grease from their hands and froze in place, staring at the sudden takeover of their feeds. The laughter was not human. It was too perfect, too mechanical, too smug. Then the image cut to a stage built of cold steel and harsh spotlights. A row of human women stood with nooses around their necks, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear, yet some managed to glare with defiance. The laugh ended and the Empire's announcer spoke in a voice as oily as tar. He declared that this was mercy, that the Empire allowed humans to live only if they remembered their place, and that resistance would be met with the fate everyone was about to witness. The hook was not just in the cruelty of the scene but in the flicker of human spirit that burst out before the trapdoor fell. One of the women spat in the camera lens, staining the perfect image, and shouted a single word that rang across billions of screens: free. The crowd forced to watch on Earth gasped, and in colonies across the galaxy, entire cities felt their guts twist. Families clutched one another, some sobbed, others turned away, but none could unsee what had been broadcast. For the Empire it was meant to be terror. For humanity it was gasoline poured onto smoldering rage. Deep in the minds of Titan, rebels who had long hidden in the shadows slammed fists into metal tables. In the slums of Mars, children who had never seen Earth wept but also swore vengeance with trembling voices. Somewhere on a drifting ship, a half-drunk mechanic barked out a laugh, not because it was funny, but because the only weapon left was defiance dressed as humor. In one hidden bunker, buried under the ruins of an old radio station, rebels sat stunned. The silence was broken not by mourning but by an ill-timed joke. A young fighter muttered that the Empire could not even tie a proper knot, because the rope broke on one of the nooses and the woman fell to the stage, coughing and alive for a moment longer before soldiers dragged her back up. It was a terrible joke, morbid and cruel, yet it cracked open the dam. Others started laughing, not because they found joy but because the pain was unbearable without humor. Someone slapped their knee, another wiped tears while cackling, and soon the bunker was full of laughter that felt like screaming disguised as comedy. The youngest among them, a technician named Zara, did not laugh. Her hands trembled over an old data recorder. She had been streaming the broadcast illegally, recording it not for herself but for the rebellion. Her voice was small but sharp as she announced that she would copy and spread this execution to every corner of the network, but not with the Empire's narration. She would slice in the laughter, the jokes, the spit, the cracks of defiance. She said people needed to see not just the horror but the cracks in the image, the places where humans refused to bow. She swore she would turn their terror into a weapon. On the colony of Haven 9, the broadcast ended but the silence it left behind was heavy. Old men shook their heads and muttered that humanity was doomed. Young boys clenched their fists and whispered that they wanted to fight. Mothers held daughters tighter, imagining them on that stage, and something fierce settled into their bones. A spark had been lit, one the Empire had not intended. Back in the bunker, the rebels argued about what came next. Some shouted for immediate action, raids, bloodshed. Others warned that they were too few, too unprepared. But the mood had changed. Where before there had been caution, now there was fire. Zara stood on a chair, her voice rising above the noise. She reminded them of the spit that smeared the perfect broadcast, of the word free that had slipped past the censors. She said humanity had been given a symbol, and symbols were stronger than armies when wielded with conviction. That night, in the darkest hours when even the stars seemed smothered by the Empire's grip, Zara uploaded the altered broadcast. It spread like a virus, from hacked satellites to smuggled datapads. People did not watch in silence. They shouted, they cursed, they laughed in places they were meant to cry. They saw not just victims but fighters who died with defiance in their eyes. The Empire wanted obedience. Instead it got anger. On a distant asteroid base, a group of smugglers replayed the footage while passing a bottle of stolen liquor. One of them snorted at the absurdity of it, then raised a toast. Another declared they would take up arms, though they had never fired more than a ship cannon in anger. Across the galaxy, the ripple grew. Even some Imperial citizens whispered doubts, disturbed by the cruelty forced onto their screens. The Empire's leaders congratulated themselves, believing fear had been cemented. They were blind to the firestorm they had ignited. Their analysts logged thousands of quiet protests, graffiti sprayed on walls, whispered songs hummed in defiance. They ignored them. After all, what could a scattered, broken species do against the might of an empire spanning stars? Yet in the cracks of that arrogance, humanity found space to grow. Underground cells began to link. Codes were written in jokes, battle plans hidden in comedy sketches smuggled across networks. The very laughter that had once mocked despair became a shield, a weapon. When one rebel commander was asked what they were fighting for, he simply answered that they were fighting so no child would ever have to laugh at a hanging again. By the end of the week, humanity was no longer silent. They spoke in whispers, in roars, in jokes, and in curses. The broadcast had been meant as a noose for the human spirit. Instead, it became the rope humans would use to drag the Empire down from its throne. And in the silence after that first broadcast, the galaxy did not hear obedience. It heard the faint, growing sound of war drums beating behind the laughter. The hook was never just the execution. It was that final, desperate shout, that single word free. It was the way pain turned to laughter, the way tears became resolve. It was the way one cruel broadcast meant to choke humanity instead taught it how to breathe fire. And though the Empire did not know it yet, they had just staged the opening act of their own downfall. The war began without warning, without uniforms, and without the kind of speeches history books pretend always exist before great conflicts. It started in alleys, on farms, in the dusty corners of forgotten colonies where humans had been abandoned to toil for the Empire. The first to rise were not trained soldiers but children who had grown up hearing stories of Earth's lost glory and old men who had long ago set aside weapons but found their hands trembling for them once more. A farmer on Ceres loaded mining explosives into a cart and rolled it down the path of an approaching patrol, detonating it with more stubbornness than skill. A group of teenagers on Mars built slingshots from ship parts and fired scrap metal at passing drones, laughing even when the drones exploded in showers of sparks that could have killed them. Humanity was improvising war, and improvisation was something the Empire never planned for. In one remarkable incident, a rebel group intended to hijack a supply convoy to steal food and medical kits. Their leader, who had never commanded anything larger than a poker table, miscalculated the explosives and blew an entire warship into fragments instead. What should have been a disastrous mistake turned into a legendary tale. The blast echoed across networks, and suddenly humans who had never picked up a weapon believed they could. The rebels themselves laughed so hard they cried when they realized they had taken down a vessel worth billions with nothing more than mining charges and bad mathematics. They replayed the footage again and again, mocking the stunned faces of Empire officers who could not believe a primitive ambush had destroyed a ship meant to intimidate. What was supposed to be a small theft became the first great symbol of victory. As small cells formed, their methods grew more brutal and yet strangely unpredictable. In the freezing tunnels of Europa, rebels lured patrols into caverns with holographic bait before sealing the exits and flooding the chamber with methane gas. On Earth, in the shattered ruins of a city once called New Santiago, families hid assassins beneath blankets and carts, rolling them directly into garrisons before springing ambushes that left Imperial soldiers cut down in chaos. These rebels did not fight like soldiers. They fought like cornered animals, with a mercilessness that frightened even themselves. Word began to spread among Empire troops that humans were not an enemy that fought clean. They laughed at death, improvised weapons, and turned disasters into victories. They were given a name whispered first in fear and then in disgust: the Ruthless Ones. The Empire's commanders responded with arrogance. They sent reports up the chain that described these uprisings as minor disturbances, savage outbreaks of desperate rabble. They believed their overwhelming fleets and disciplined soldiers would crush such chaos in days. They did not account for the way chaos multiplied. Every broadcast meant to terrify the population instead gave rebels new material to mock, twist, and turn into inspiration. Jokes about rope and nooses became coded messages. Humor that had once been whispered behind closed doors turned into rallying cries carved into walls. The Empire did not understand that laughter itself had become a weapon sharper than blades. On one captured world, a squad of humans calling themselves the Unbroken set a trap so outrageous it seemed impossible. They dressed as Imperial officers using stolen uniforms and marched boldly into a fortress. When questioned, they carried forged documents full of jokes disguised as military orders. The officers who inspected them were too confused by the bizarre language to react before the Unbroken opened fire. The fortress fell not in days but in minutes. The story spread until even children on distant colonies acted out the scene, mocking Empire soldiers and turning the rebels into legends. Still, the cost was heavy. For every accidental victory, for every daring raid that succeeded against all odds, there were failures. Whole villages were burned in retaliation. Families were wiped out because a brother or sister had dared to carry a weapon. The rebels learned quickly that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. They struck with brutality, ensuring their enemy feared them as much as they hated them. It was a transformation that weighed heavily on many hearts, but the fire of vengeance pushed them forward. Zara, the technician whose recordings had spread the first sparks, traveled constantly now. She worked tirelessly to intercept broadcasts, splice them into rebellious propaganda, and deliver them back to the people. Her voice became recognizable, though she never showed her face. To millions, she was simply the ghost broadcaster, the one who turned terror into comedy and despair into fury. She joked that she had become a comedian by accident, and her words carried more power than any general's orders. For soldiers ready to give up, her messages reignited resolve. For frightened families, her defiant tone reminded them they were not alone. The Empire noticed. Casualty reports began to trickle in with disturbing numbers. Entire platoons were vanishing. Convoys were disappearing in regions once considered secure. Even propaganda stations reported difficulties, as their messages were overridden by rebellious laughter. At first, the commanders dismissed the threats as exaggerated. But when 3 separate warships failed to return from what should have been simple patrols, whispers spread even among the elite officers. Humanity, they realized, was not fighting to win battles. They were fighting to unbalance the Empire itself. They were fighting dirty, unexpected, ruthless, and it was working. What unsettled the Empire most was not the destruction but the attitude. Captured reports described human fighters laughing as they bled, making jokes as they cut down enemies, mocking officers with impressions before detonating explosives. Soldiers trained to face disciplined armies did not know how to respond to foes who used chaos as strategy. The Empire relied on order. Humans thrived in disorder. For the first time in centuries, the mighty machine of the Empire began to wobble. And yet, among all the victories, there were shadows of doubt. Some rebels worried they were becoming the very monsters they despised. When a group on Ganymede executed an entire squad of captured soldiers live on camera, arguments erupted within the rebellion. Some claimed it was necessary to send a message. Others feared it proved the Empire's propaganda that humans were savages undeserving of survival. The debates grew fierce, but in the end, the will to fight outweighed the guilt. War, they reminded themselves, was never clean. As the second month of rebellion ended, Zara released another broadcast. It was spliced with footage of the accidental destruction of the Empire warship, mixed with laughter, cheers, and a final message that spread faster than any Empire warning. She declared that humans had stopped being victims. They were now the storm, unpredictable and unstoppable. Her words echoed across every hidden base, every smuggler's ship, every family huddled in fear. For the first time, humanity did not just believe in survival. They believed in victory. Trust was already fragile when the rebellion began, but by the time the third month of the uprising rolled in, suspicion had become a disease. Every rebel camp whispered of spies, every alliance was weighed with hesitation, and even laughter was sometimes cut short by glances that searched for hidden betrayal. Among the growing resistance was a commander named Darius, a man with a silver tongue and a smile that made weary soldiers feel safe. He told stories around campfires, remembered everyone's names, and claimed he had once been an Imperial officer who defected after witnessing the cruelty of the broadcasts. His presence inspired confidence. Squads fought harder under his words, and wounded fighters swore they would crawl back to battle if Darius asked them to. It seemed, for a time, that the rebels had found a hero. But heroes were fragile things, and war had a way of breaking illusions. The truth of Darius's loyalty shattered one night when an ambush fell on a hidden outpost in the Wraith Nebula. Empire forces stormed in with precision far too accurate to be coincidence. Tunnels collapsed, fires spread, and dozens of fighters were cut down before they could even reach their weapons. Zara escaped by sheer luck, dragged through a vent shaft by a smuggler who cursed Darius's name as he pointed to the perfectly timed assault. Later, as survivors regrouped in scattered cells, the whispers began to harden into certainty. Darius was no hero. He was a spy, planted by the Empire to bleed the rebellion from within. The betrayal cut deeper than any battle wound. Soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to Darius now spat his name with venom. Some refused to believe it at first, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But then came the recordings, intercepted Empire transmissions that showed Darius reporting on rebel positions with the same calm smile he had worn by the fireside. The man who had promised freedom had handed them slaughter. The rebellion mourned the lost fighters, but the wound left behind was more dangerous than numbers. Trust fractured. Cells that had once coordinated now moved separately, each fearing the other could be compromised. Humor, which had been the glue binding rebels together, became sharper and more bitter. In one bunker, fighters joked that the only reliable comrade was the gun in their hands. In another, someone painted a mural of Darius smiling with a knife in his back. They laughed at it, but the laughter was jagged, carrying the edge of rage. Even Zara, whose broadcasts had kept hope alive, found herself struggling to muster her defiance. Her voice on the airwaves carried weight still, but in the quiet moments she wondered how many others smiled while secretly plotting betrayal. The Empire, of course, exploited the moment. Their propaganda channels announced that humans could not trust even themselves, that rebellion only bred chaos and paranoia. They showed images of Darius laughing with rebels before feeding information to his imperial masters. They painted him as a man who had never betrayed anyone at all, because to them he was loyal from the start. To the rebels, he became a ghost of guilt, a reminder that even their strongest bonds could be illusions. Yet from that despair came a shift. A new kind of brutality began to grow, born not from numbers but from survival instinct. The rebels swore they would never again allow themselves to be blind. Trust was replaced with ruthlessness. When suspected spies were found, trials were swift and mercy was rare. Camps turned grim, but strangely, efficiency grew. Squads operated tighter, sharper, aware that any mistake could mean annihilation. Betrayal had not broken the rebellion, it had hardened it into something more dangerous. One night in the shattered city of Arcani's prime, rebels gathered around a makeshift table. They debated how to respond to the growing propaganda war. The Empire painted them as savages, monsters, and now, traitors to each other. But instead of denying it, one young soldier suggested they embrace the image. If the Empire wanted to call them monsters, then monsters they would become. The suggestion sparked outrage at first, but as the hours passed, the idea began to make a grim kind of sense. They could never outmatch the Empire in discipline or numbers, but they could terrify them. They could become unpredictable, ruthless, exactly as the propaganda described. The decision was sealed after another betrayal. A small squad allowed a supposed refugee into their ranks, only to be bombed in their sleep. Of the 20 who slept in that bunker, only 3 survived. When the news spread, the resistance no longer hesitated. They announced to their people and to the galaxy that they would not fight as soldiers. They would fight as nightmares, striking from shadows, laughing as they bled, and giving no quarter. Humanity was no longer begging for recognition. It was demanding fear. Zara recorded the declaration herself. Her voice was steady, even though her hands trembled. She said the Empire thought it could break them by exposing their weakness, but all it had done was teach them to stop playing fair. She admitted openly that betrayal had cost them dearly, but she promised it had burned away their illusions. She told the galaxy that humans were not soldiers bound by rules, but wildfires that could not be contained. Her words crackled through every hidden channel, turning paranoia into defiance. If no one could be trusted, then they would trust only in victory. The Empire's generals were unsettled. They had hoped betrayal would splinter the rebellion into nothing. Instead, it seemed to have sharpened it into a blade. Reports told of ambushes where rebels showed no hesitation, where captured soldiers were executed without delay. Patrols returned describing laughter echoing through smoke, whispers in the dark that mocked them before gunfire erupted. The psychological toll began to spread among Imperial forces. Some refused to patrol certain sectors, claiming the humans were everywhere, that even silence felt like a trap. But in the shadows, there were those in the rebellion who still struggled with the path they had chosen. A medic named Alara whispered to Zara that she feared they were becoming too much like the Empire. She had seen rebels execute prisoners, burn villages suspected of harboring spies, and even turn on each other with suspicion too thin to justify bloodshed. Zara listened, guilt heavy in her chest, but when she went back to her recorder, she told no one of her doubts. The rebellion could not afford hesitation. The most shocking turn came when an intercepted transmission revealed Darius himself still alive, still serving the Empire. In it, he laughed about how easy it had been to earn their trust, and how humans always believed in heroes even when they should not. The recording spread among rebels, and instead of breaking them further, it became a rallying cry. They mocked him in songs, cursed his name in battle, and vowed that when they finally caught him, they would make him the symbol of their vengeance. The man who had once united them with his smile now united them with his treachery. The rebellion had stopped pretending to be an army by the time the fourth chapter of war began. They were something else entirely now, something the Empire had no language for. Imperial reports tried to classify them as insurgents or terrorists, but even those words did not capture the truth. Humanity had become unpredictable, a force of chaos that slipped through the cracks of order. Soldiers in polished armor who had once laughed at the idea of facing human resistance now dreaded their deployments. They whispered about the dogs of war, a name given half in mockery and half in fear, because these humans fought with no rhythm, no code, only the desperate hunger of survivors who had nothing left to lose. On the shattered plains of Callisto, an imperial parade was meant to remind citizens of the Empire's glory. Marching bands blared, banners waved, and the governor boasted about stability. It ended in madness. Rebels disguised as musicians infiltrated the parade, carrying instruments wired with explosives. When the governor raised his hand to speak, the trumpets blared a final note before detonating, shredding banners and scattering soldiers in chaos. But it did not end there. Another group of rebels had filled the floats with unstable chemical canisters, and when gunfire erupted, the floats exploded in clouds of noxious gas. Civilians panicked, soldiers fired wildly, and in the middle of the confusion a rebel with a painted mask stood on the stage and shouted jokes about the Empire's lack of rhythm. He danced mockingly before vanishing into the smoke. The scene was both horrific and absurd, a massacre laced with dark comedy that spread through the galaxy faster than any official report. The Empire had trained for wars of discipline and numbers, but this was something else. They faced enemies who laughed as they burned supply depots, who painted crude jokes on wrecked starships, who sabotaged communications with recordings of mocking voices. Entire battalions were demoralized not just by losses but by the sense that they were not fighting soldiers at all, but lunatics who treated war as both survival and theater. Imperial psychologists begged commanders to consider the mental toll, but arrogance smothered their warnings. The Empire insisted order would always crush chaos. Yet every week, more convoys disappeared, more planets slipped out of control, and more civilians whispered that the rebels might actually succeed. Among the rebels, the transformation was clear. No longer burdened by the need to appear noble, they leaned into their reputation. Captains ordered raids accompanied by mocking slogans, fighters decorated their armor with grotesque symbols, and squads competed to see who could leave the most terrifying message behind. In the ruins of a mining station, a group called the Iron Teeth hung scraps of Imperial banners from corpses and left a single note scrawled in blood that read "Try harder." The brutality shocked even their allies, but it worked. Soldiers sent to hunt the Iron Teeth deserted rather than face them. Zara watched this change with both pride and unease. Her broadcast fueled it, her words shaping the image of humanity as the storm that could not be contained. She spoke with venom and humor, splicing propaganda with laughter, promising victory through terror. She knew her voice was keeping the rebellion alive, but in the quiet between transmissions she wondered if they were losing something vital. She thought about the faces of the women hanged in the first broadcast, about their defiance, and asked herself if those women had dreamed their legacy would be massacres dressed as comedy. Still, when the recorder light blinked, she silenced her doubts. There was no room for hesitation when the galaxy was listening. The Empire itself began to crack in ways no one predicted. Civilians in Imperial cities watched the broadcasts and started asking questions. If the rebels were as savage as propaganda claimed, why were soldiers dying in such numbers? If the Empire was as invincible as it boasted, why were entire fleets being humiliated by a species they called primitive? Some whispered admiration, others fear, but either way loyalty wavered. Markets faltered, riots broke out in distant colonies, and governors sent frantic messages begging for reinforcements that never came. The Empire's strength had always rested on the illusion of control, but illusions do not survive under constant laughter. One battle in particular cemented the rebels' reputation. On the industrial moon of Dravos, an entire Imperial regiment prepared to crush a pocket of human fighters. The rebels, outnumbered 20-1, booby-trapped factories with collapsing scaffolds, oil floods, and malfunctioning robots that turned on their masters. When the battle began, chaos consumed the regiment. Machines sparked, conveyor belts jammed, soldiers slipped in oil and were cut down by rebels who appeared from shadows. Throughout it all, speakers hidden across the complex played mocking jokes and songs, each one punctuated by explosions. By the time the regiment retreated, they left behind more than half their number and the terrifying conviction that the humans were not just fighters, but nightmares who turned war into theater. For all their successes, the rebels knew there was no turning back. They had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. Mercy was rare, hesitation rarer. Even when civilians begged them to spare captured soldiers, the rebels refused. They told themselves it was necessary, that any weakness would be exploited. Yet some carried the weight in silence. Medics who patched up fighters whispered about the cost to their souls. Parents who sent their children to fight wondered what kind of world those children would return to, if they returned at all. Still, the fire burned too hot to stop. The rebellion was no longer about survival. It was about annihilation. The Empire grew desperate. Reports from its own intelligence warned that morale among soldiers was collapsing. Some units refused to fight, claiming they were haunted by laughter in the dark. Entire platoons surrendered rather than patrol human-controlled sectors. Commanders ordered harsher measures, burning villages, exterminating families, but these acts only fed the fury. Each atrocity became another broadcast, another spark to fuel the storm. The harder the Empire tried to crush humanity, the more humanity sharpened its claws. In the midst of this chaos, Zara broadcast one of her most infamous messages. She declared that the Empire had built its throne on fear, but now fear belonged to humanity. She promised they would not stop until the throne was dust and the galaxy laughed at the memory of its rulers. Her words were replayed across worlds, turning into graffiti, chants, and whispered prayers. The message was so powerful that even Imperial citizens repeated it in secret. For the first time, the Empire faced not just rebellion, but a rebellion that had captured the imagination of its own people. By the end of that chapter of war, the choice was clear. Humanity could no longer coexist with the Empire. Too much blood had been spilled, too many jokes made in the ashes of cities, too many battles turned into nightmares. The rebels had unleashed something unstoppable. They were not just survivors anymore. They were predators. And though some hearts ached at what they had become, none could deny the truth. The Empire was cracking, and the laughter of humanity was echoing louder than ever across the stars. The rebellion had always thrived in shadows, striking from the edges of the galaxy where the Empire least expected them, but as the war deepened, the rebels realized the time for whispers was over. They no longer wanted to be ghosts gnawing at the edges of power. They wanted to stand in the light, to turn the Empire's own weapons of spectacle against it. That decision led them to the boldest act yet, an attack not on soldiers or ships but on the heart of the Empire's propaganda machine. The rebels set their sights on an Imperial broadcast station, the very kind of place that had once shown the hangings that started it all. To seize control of such a place would not only shatter the illusion of invincibility, but would give humanity a stage of its own. The plan was as reckless as it was brilliant. The broadcast hub on Arion Prime was guarded by walls of steel and legions of soldiers. Its towers beamed propaganda across sectors, ensuring that every citizen, loyal or conquered, lived under the Empire's voice. To touch it seemed impossible, yet the rebels had learned to turn impossibility into comedy. They infiltrated disguised not as soldiers or workers but as entertainers brought in to perform for the staff. A comedy troupe, armed not with scripts but with explosives, walked through security with painted smiles. It was absurd, but absurdity had become humanity's greatest disguise. When the performance began, laughter filled the main hall, forced and nervous from the Imperial staff. Then the curtain fell and with it came the real act. Weapons hidden in props flashed to life, guards fell before they realized the show had changed, and the rebels stormed the control tower. Zara herself was there, carrying a recorder slung across her back. She had not fought with weapons often, but this was not about battle. This was about seizing the airwaves. As the rebels locked down the station, she stood before the same cameras that had once shown humanity's humiliation. Now they would show something else. The broadcast flickered across the galaxy. Citizens expecting another Imperial announcement saw instead a young woman with wild eyes and dirt on her face, flanked by masked fighters. Zara's voice rang clear, mocking and sharp. She said the Empire had made a habit of forcing people to watch executions, of laughing while humanity wept. Now, she declared, it was the Empire's turn to be laughed at. Behind her, rebels dragged and captured officers, forcing them to sit on stage while the galaxy watched. Some were terrified, others furious, but all were helpless as Zara announced that the world was seeing the truth, unfiltered and unstoppable. But fate has a way of twisting even the boldest plans. Just as she began to speak of freedom and fire, the station's systems faltered. Sabotage from within, or perhaps a flaw in the hasty takeover, triggered malfunctions. Instead of a clear broadcast, images stuttered, sound warped, and at one point a voice filter replaced Zara's words with comical squeaks. Across the galaxy, what was meant to be a call to arms turned into a bizarre parody. Citizens laughed not only at the Empire's humiliation but at the rebels themselves, who seemed caught in their own absurd theater. It should have been a disaster, yet strangely it was not. For the first time, people outside the rebellion laughed with them rather than at them. The accidental comedy spread faster than speeches could have. It made the rebels human, unpredictable, and strangely relatable. In the middle of this chaos, tragedy struck. A squad of Imperial reinforcements breached the station. Gunfire roared through the halls. Rebels fell as they defended the tower, and among them was Commander Rail, one of the most beloved leaders of the resistance. He fought until his last breath, covering Zara as she fled deeper into the control room. His final moments were not hidden. They were broadcast live, his blood staining the floor as he raised his weapon and shouted for humanity to keep laughing even in the face of death. Billions saw him fall, and billions felt the sting of his sacrifice. The Empire celebrated his death in their records, calling it a victory. But they misunderstood what the broadcast had done. Instead of breaking spirits, Rail's final stand burned itself into memory. His smile, his defiance, his absurd last words turned him into a martyr. Across colonies, people replayed his fall not with silence but with cheers. They said he had stolen the Empire's stage and turned it into humanity's theater of rebellion. Children drew pictures of him laughing in his final breath, and rebels took oaths to fight in his name. Zara survived, barely, carried out of the collapsing station by fighters who refused to leave her behind. The broadcast finally cut off, the Empire regaining control of its own systems, but the damage was already done. For the first time in history, the galaxy had seen the Empire lose its grip live. No amount of censorship could erase the images, no amount of propaganda could undo the memory of rebels mocking their rulers on their own stage. The seed planted was far more powerful than the station itself. In the days that followed, Imperial citizens whispered about what they had seen. Some laughed, others cried, but most could not stop replaying it in their minds. The idea that the Empire could be mocked publicly, humiliated before billions, was more destructive than any battle. The illusion of invincibility was cracked, and through that crack entire worlds began to slip away. Governors who had once spoken of loyalty now questioned their allegiance. Soldiers hesitated before marching, fearing they might become the next punchline. The galaxy had seen the rebels, not as savages, not as shadows, but as human beings who fought with chaos, comedy, and courage. The rebellion gathered strength. New recruits poured in, inspired by the broadcast. Smugglers offered ships, colonies pledged resources, and even some Imperial defectors came forward. The loss of Commander Rail hurt deeply, but his death was not in vain. He had given them more than a battle. He had given them a symbol, a story to rally around. Zara, though shaken, returned to her recorder. Her voice cracked at first, but she forced it steady. She told the galaxy that Rail's laughter would echo in every fight to come, that every rebel would carry it as a weapon. The Empire reeled from the blow. In their halls of power, generals argued over how such a breach could have happened. Some demanded harsher measures, others warned that brutality only fed the fire. The Emperor himself raged at the humiliation, vowing that the rebels would be made examples of. But no matter how many soldiers he sent, no matter how many colonies he punished, he could not undo what the galaxy had witnessed. The broadcast was already legend. By the time the dust settled, the rebels had transformed. They were no longer whispers in shadows but a force that could seize the spotlight. They had shown the galaxy that the Empire could bleed, and more importantly, that it could be laughed at. For an empire built on fear, that was the deepest wound of all. And though the price had been high, the rebellion knew they had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. They had taken the stage, and now the galaxy was waiting for the next act. The war had reached its breaking point. Entire sectors burned, fleets vanished into ambushes, and whispers of rebellion spread faster than Imperial patrols could silence them. The Empire, once untouchable, was staggering beneath the weight of chaos. Humanity, once enslaved and mocked, had clawed its way into the heart of the galaxy's struggle. But with every victory came escalation, and now the rebellion faced the greatest challenge yet. The Empire was collapsing, but a collapsing beast is the most dangerous of all. Across battlefields stretched from the moons of Saturn to the glittering cities of Arion Prime, the Empire unleashed its might. Legions of soldiers were marched out not to win but to annihilate. The order from the Emperor was clear: no negotiations, no mercy, crush humanity so thoroughly that no child would dare dream of rebellion again. But the rebels had become something else, something far more dangerous than armies. They were the ruthless storm, a tide of fury and unpredictability, and the storm could not be contained. The final battles unfolded in chaos. On the industrial world of Saturn, rebels detonated entire factories, luring in regiments before collapsing smokestacks onto their heads. On the desert planet Orith, farmers armed with nothing more than flamethrowers and mining drills tore through armored convoys. In the orbit of Earth itself, ships crewed by smugglers and exiles rammed Imperial cruisers in suicidal strikes, laughing into their calms as their final words. Every sector became a stage, every clash a performance, and the galaxy watched in horror and awe as humanity bled and laughed at the same time. Yet even in their ruthless storm, something unexpected emerged. Amid the carnage, some rebels began to choose mercy. In the city of Velar, a group of captured Imperial soldiers were lined up for execution before an audience of cheering rebels. But instead of pulling the trigger, the commander ordered their release, announcing that humanity would not mirror the cruelty of its enemy. The decision sparked argument and fury among other fighters, but it spread like wildfire. The galaxy watched the footage and was stunned. For so long the rebels had been seen as merciless beasts, yet here they were showing restraint the Empire never had. The contradiction confused and inspired in equal measure. It proved that even in their chaos, humanity could choose not to be the monsters the Empire claimed they were. This twist unnerved the Empire's leaders more than any ambush. They knew how to crush enemies who fought with savagery, but they did not know how to respond to an opponent who could be both ruthless and merciful, who could laugh while killing but also refuse vengeance when victory allowed it. Soldiers began to defect in larger numbers, some even turning their weapons on their commanders. Civilians rose in riots that spread faster than Imperial troops could suppress. The throne was cracking not just from force but from doubt, and doubt was the one weapon the Empire could never defend against. Inside the Imperial Palace, the Emperor raged. His voice thundered through the halls as he demanded loyalty, but even among his own court there were whispers of fear. He decided to reclaim control the only way he knew how, with another broadcast. He would mock humanity himself, humiliate them before billions, and prove that he was untouchable. The stage was prepared, the cameras ready, the galaxy forced once again to watch. The Emperor sat on his throne of gold and sneered into the lens, speaking of humanity as vermin, as animals too stupid to survive without his mercy. He laughed, a cruel echo of the synthetic laughter that had started it all. But fate had other plans. As he mocked them, the rebels struck. A hidden signal hijacked the broadcast, just as Zara had once done in the station. Only this time, the failure belonged not to the rebels but to the Empire. The systems glitched, the Emperor's grand speech warped into absurd squeals and distortions, his proud face distorted into grotesque caricatures. Across the galaxy, billions roared with laughter not at humans but at him. His furious shouts only made it worse. He stood, shouting for silence, and in his rage tripped over the edge of his throne's platform. The cameras caught every detail, the mighty ruler sprawling on the floor like a clown before the galaxy he meant to terrify. He rose to scream again, and in that moment a blast rocked the palace. Rebels had breached the outer defenses. The feed cut, but the damage was irreversible. The last image billions saw of their emperor was not of power but of a man made into a joke. The palace fell within days. The emperor tried to flee, but he was cornered not by generals or assassins, but by ordinary rebels, miners and farmers who had come to see the end. He died not in glorious battle but in irony, mocked until his last breath, begging for dignity that he had never granted his victims. When the rebels told the story later, they said the galaxy's greatest tyrant died laughing, though whether it was his own or theirs, no one could quite agree. With his fall, the empire unraveled. Governors surrendered, fleets deserted, and worlds declared independence. The rebellion, once scattered, now stood at the center of a galaxy trembling on the edge of something new. Victory had come, but it was a victory laced with scars. Millions were dead, cities reduced to ash, families broken beyond repair. The rebels who survived bore the weight of what they had done, the brutality they had embraced, the lives they had taken. They had unleashed humanity in its rawest form, and now they had to decide what came next. Zara stood once more before a recorder, her face older, harder, yet still burning with fire. She spoke to the galaxy not with mockery this time, but with something gentler. She said humanity had won not because it was stronger, not because it was more ruthless, but because it had refused to be silenced. She reminded them of the first broadcast, of the woman who spat in defiance before the rope took her life, of the laughter that had grown out of pain, of the stubborn refusal to kneel. She told the galaxy that the rebellion's greatest weapon had not been brutality, but the ability to laugh through horror, to mock tyrants until they crumbled. That, she said, was humanity's punchline. Across worlds, people cheered. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stared at the stars in silence. The empire was gone, but the future was uncertain. Yet for the first time in generations, humans could shape it themselves. The war had ended not with despair but with irony, a tyrant undone by the very theater of cruelty he once commanded. And so the story of the rebellion closed not with silence but with sound, with the echo of laughter carried across battlefields now quiet, across ruins now waiting to be rebuilt, across the stars that no longer belonged to an empire. Humanity had survived, had risen, had unleashed its storm, and in the end, it had discovered that its greatest weapon was not the sword or the bomb, but the refusal to surrender its spirit. The galaxy, once ruled by fear, now carried a different sound, one that promised both healing and danger. The sound of humanity laughing at the impossible, laughing even in the face of death, laughing as it stepped into the future it had claimed with its own blood and fire.